People considering cybersecurity careers often hear that GRC is a good entry point, especially if you're not interested in the deeply technical side of things. But when they are asked, what a GRC actually does all day, the answers are incredibly vague. You'll hear about governance frameworks, policies, documentation. Maybe someone says it's the business side of security. But none of that really tells you what the work actually feels like or whether you'd be good at it. So let's talk about what a GRC analyst actually does. Not the textbook definition, the actual day-to-day work. So the confusion here, the confusion really makes sense, right? Because GRC sits in an unusual place in cybersecurity. It's not security operations where you're monitoring alerts and responding to incidents. It's not security engineering where you're configuring firewalls and building systems. It's not penetration testing where you're actively breaking things. But here's what really catches people off guard. It's also not simply the non-technical side of cybersecurity where you can work without understanding technology. That misconception really creates problems. I've seen people enter GRC roles thinking they can avoid learning anything technical, and they struggle immediately. They can't evaluate whether controls actually work. They can't communicate credibly with technical teams. They become documentation coordinators instead of analysts. The reality sits between those extremes. So what GRC actually means, governance, risk, and compliance aren't three separate jobs. They're connected functions that help organizations make security decisions, evaluate, and treat risk, and demonstrate they're meeting various obligations. A GRC analyst translates between technical teams and business stakeholders. You need to understand both domains well enough, to ask good questions, identify gaps, communicate, risk accurately. Success depends less on configuring systems and more on understanding how systems work, the controls, the people, and the processes, all together. That's a different kind of thinking than a security operations, may require. But it's not easier. Let me walk you through what this actually looks like. First off, let's talk about risk assessments, right? A lot of GRC work revolves around conducting, risk assessments. This is not filling out a risk matrix template, and rating everything medium. Risk assessments start with, understanding what assets matter. You talk to business process owners to understand, how their systems work, what data they handle, who has access, where dependencies actually exist. You need enough to know enough, about the attack vectors and what they actually look like, and what could actually go wrong here. How would an attacker approach this? What happens if the data gets exposed, or this process gets disrupted? But you also need business context. A vulnerability that sounds critical in a textbook might be low risk because of how the system is actually used, who can access it, or what other controls exist around it. The technical knowledge matters because you have to distinguish between theoretical risks and practical ones. If you can't understand basic system architecture or data flows, you'll identify risks that don't exist and miss ones that actually do. You're building a picture of where real vulnerability exists, and what controls are actually feasible. Then you document findings so decision makers can understand the risks and prioritize those responses. That documentation has to be specific, enough to be useful, but accessible enough that non-technical stakeholders can act on it. When it comes to validating controls, when you're reviewing controls for an audit or an assessment, you need to understand what the actual control is supposed to accomplish, and whether the evidence actually proves it works. Say you're reviewing access controls. The policy states that user access gets reviewed quarterly, and inappropriate access gets removed. You receive a spreadsheet showing quarterly reviews, were completed. Is that enough? It depends. Did someone actually look at each user's access and validate it against their role, or did managers just sign off a list, without reviewing anything? Does the evidence show that inappropriate access was identified and removed, or just that a meeting happened? Looking at the firewall, rule screenshot means nothing if you can't read the configuration well enough to verify it matches what the control says it actually should be. Reviewing access logs requires understanding of what normal versus suspicious patterns look like. You're not configuring these systems yourself, but you need enough technical literacy to evaluate whether those controls exist, operates as described, and would actually prevent or detect the risk it's meant to address. This work often feels tedious. You're collecting documentation, reviewing configurations, checking logs, right? But it matters because this is how you separate security theater from actual security. Next up is risk management or vendor management. Looking at security questionnaires, contracts. This process may be simple, but send a vendor the questionnaire, review their responses, make a risk decision. In practice, it's more complicated. Vendors have incentives to make their own security sound better than it is. You need to read the responses critically. When a vendor says they have appropriate security controls, what does that mean? When they claim compliance with a framework, is that third-party validated or self-assessed? You need to understand what controls vendors should have based on their data or access they'll actually have. A vendor processing credit card data needs different controls than one shipping promotional materials. The work involves following up on gaps, evaluating whether their security is adequate for the specific risk they introduce, and helping the business make informed decisions about accepting, mitigating, or even avoiding those risks. Sometimes the answer is this vendor security is weak, but the business need is critical, so we'll add monitoring and contractual requirements. Sometimes it's the risk is too high for the value. You're not making those decisions alone, but you're providing the analysis that enables good decisions instead of blind ones. As far as remediation tracking, after audits or assessments identify those gaps, someone tracks remediation. Often that's a GRC analyst. You work with technical teams to understand why findings exist, what it would take to fix them, right, and whether other controls reduce the risk. How often prioritize when the resources are limited as well. The challenge is balancing urgency, feasibility, and competing priorities. A finding might be generally difficult to fix because it requires architectural changes or affects critical processes. The technical team isn't making excuses. The work is legitimately complex. But you also see findings that sit unaddressed, because no one's paying attention to, or team, keeps deprioritizing the actual security work. You need to understand the difference. That requires enough technical credibility to have honest conversations about what's realistic and what's avoidance. It also requires, communication skills, to escalate when, timeless slip and help leadership understand, what the risk, without making any panic happen here. You're tracking progress, identifying when issues need escalation, translating technical timelines into business terms. Executives can use for resource decisions as well. And so moving on to policy work. GRC analysts often maintain security policies, standards, procedures. This sounds straightforward until you actually try it. The challenge is writing requirements that are specific enough to be useful, but flexible enough to work across different systems and business units. A password policy with strict technical requirements might work for corporate laptops, but create problems for specialized systems that just can't support those requirements. A data classification policy needs to be clear enough that people can actually use it. Not so complex, everyone ignores it. You need to understand how technical teams will implement the policy, what's realistic to enforce, what can be automated, how to measure compliance. If you write policies without understanding implementation constraints, you create theater. The policy looks good, but no one follows it because it's impractical, and no one can measure compliance because the requirements can't be validated. Effective policy work requires technical literacy combined with business judgment and understanding how organizations actually change. So, is GRC right for you? If you're considering GRC, here's what matters, right? You need enough technical foundation to read configurations, understand basic networking, and access controls, follow technical conversations as well. You don't need to be a systems administrator, but you need technical literacy. Without it, you can't really evaluate whether controls work or communicate credibly with technical teams. You also need to be comfortable with relationships, with management and communication. You'll spend time in meetings with technical teams, process owners, auditors, executives as well. If you strongly prefer heads down technical work with minimal collaboration, GRC may not be the fit regardless of your technical skills. Entry-level GRC roles often involve significant evidence collection, and documentation work that can feel very repetitive. The strategic work typically comes after you build credibility and understand how organization actually works. Expect that progression. Look for roles with exposure to multiple functions, risk assessments, audit support, vendor risk, policy management, and policy work, not just compliance documentation. Broader experience helps you understand how the pieces connect. Most importantly, develop judgment about what matters by understanding why those controls exist, not just that they're required. Learn to distinguish between controls that reduce real risk and controls that exist for compliance checkboxes. That judgment is what makes a GRC analyst very valuable, beyond being a documentation coordinator. So final thought, GRC work requires just different thinking, than security, operations, or engineering, but it's not simply the non-technical side of cybersecurity. The work creates value by connecting technical controls to business objectives, helping organizations make informed risk decisions, preventing both overinvestment in low-value controls and underinvestment in critical ones. So if you enjoy work between technical and business domains, you're good at asking questions that uncover gaps. If you can translate between different groups, GRC might be a strong fit. Start building both technical literacy and communication skills. Understand frameworks like NIST and ISO 27001, not by memorizing them, but understanding what problems they solve. Learn enough about technology to evaluate whether controls make sense. The work matters. It just looks different than most people expect. So I hope you enjoyed this, and definitely feel free to chime in next time for more.